Welcome, folks. We're going to get started in another minute or so, just giving a little bit of time for people to tune in and set up the live stream for Facebook.
Are we live yet?
Oh, we are, yes.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yes, if you look in the participant list, you'll be able to see the panelists and you'll be able to see the attendees who are here as well. All right, great. I think we can go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to the first GCWS event for the 2020 to 2021 academic year. It's our Feminisms Unbound, the Neoliberal University and Academic Feminism. The GCWS is a collaboration between 9 member institutions in the Boston area: Boston College, Boston University, Brandeis, Harvard, MIT, Northeastern, Simmons, Tufts, and UMass Boston. And we bring together feminist scholars and faculty from across our institutions and more through graduate level courses and a myriad of events each year. We're looking forward to connecting remotely with people this fall, and we'll see about the spring through these Feminisms Unbound panels, and especially our biannual graduate student conference. This year's conference theme is Radical Love Through Differences, and more information is going to be available about that soon. You can find GCWS online on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And for tonight, we welcome you to engage with each other during the webinar through the chat. And then any questions that you have for our panelists, you can add to the Q&A. We're going to pose questions to our speakers after they've each had a chance to present. And then when applicable, add whoever your question is for in the Q&A. You'll also be able to see the questions that other people are asking and upvote the ones that you also want to hear an answer to. If you want to see the closed captioning for the Zoom, you can hit the CC button on the bottom of the Zoom. And I'll also share a link in the chat where you can see the transcript as it's being created on a website, and you'll be able to adjust the font size and the color there. But thank you all so much for joining. If you want to turn your attention now to Dr. Faith Smith of Brandeis, who will be moderating the panel and introducing the speakers tonight.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Stacy. Welcome to the Neoliberal University and Academic Feminisms panel. This panel takes its inspiration from our insistent critique of the academic corporation in which we find ourselves working today. Increasingly, faculty are underpaid and hired as temporary, as contingent, or as lecturers who are nevertheless often expected to give service beyond teaching. Or senior administrators compensated at the same levels as the corporate structure often are hired as much for their fundraising abilities as for their academic inclinations or interests. Juggling multiple jobs, or students are enmeshed in an aggregation of precarity that is not only financial. Their protests of the institution's race, gendered, sex, and class inequities, for instance, are repurposed into website photographs designed to advertise the institution's openness to critique. Particularly as women, as queer, as trans, and as first generation, the discomfort with an institution that is hostile to them is transformed into a burden to reform the institution, that is to say, into their burden to reform the institution. Does our activism and theorizing alleviate or intensify these inequities? How is the genealogy of such processes, which we often hear ourselves take for granted as deeply unethical, connected to the humanist values we espouse and teach? Some senior administrative positions, such as diversity officers, for instance, are the result of our successful struggles to force the administration to be ethical. What if the neoliberal university is not, in fact, antithetical to our goals or practices as feminists and as principal social actors in the institution? How might we think both critically and imaginatively about the temporal implications of the neoliberal university today and our place in it? The claim now made on all of our time, our conception of free time, or justification of time spent away from the institution's demands, the disproportionate burden of time placed on some students, staff, and faculty. And I'll just add here that this panel was conceived in summer 2019 and originally scheduled for this past March. And so I could add two things here. First, in the wake of a summer of institutional apologies, I'm thinking of Hazel Carby's recent parsing of the difference between the corporate or state apology, which risks incurring legal and financial liability, and the expression of regret that is meant to stave off such liability. Bringing this directly into the sphere of higher education, Rafael Lopez of Baruch College in the Chronicle of Higher Education has noted the inevitable journey of these corporate statements to higher education. And Lopez terms such statements the emergent genre of the digital age, calling them toothless affirmations and reaffirmations that stand in the place of and divert attention from the absence of concrete structural changes. And secondly, and finally, what happens to all of the fantastic, urgent, critical analysis provided by some of our colleagues on social media, on television, in the newspapers, from which we've been able to benefit in shedding light on crisis after crisis, whether Hurricane Maria, COVID-19, Black Lives Matter, and all Black Lives Matter protests, and the rhetoric surrounding the elections. How is this kind of work going to be counted and assessed in the protocols of promotion and tenure in our various institutions? And here I'm speaking as someone who encourages colleagues to work on and finish up the first book as a key step in the actually existing authenticating machine. With that introduction, I wanted to thank Badria El-Saba and Tina Stevenson. I want certainly to thank again and again Stacey Lance, the program manager for the consortium whom you've just heard from, for managing all these events and for ushering us into this online reality so efficiently and so patiently. I want to thank my co-chairs of the Feminisms Unbound series, Elora Chowdhury of the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and Kareem Kupchandani of Tufts University. It's a continuing pleasure to dream dreams with them. Thank you for joining us today, and I'm going to welcome our panelists. Eng-Beng Lim will speak first, Associate Professor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Dartmouth College. He's a founding director of the Dartmouth Consortium of Studies in Race, Migration, and Sexuality, and Associate Professor of the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program at Dartmouth. He's the author of the award-winning Brown Boys and Rice Queens Spellbinding Performance in the Asias, 2004, and is at work on not one, but two monographs, one on perverse megastructures, and the other on queer friendships and visual fantasies of boy harems with a botanical theme. He's written broadly on toxic masculinity, queer performance, Asian American discomforts, and parasitic sex, on bully bloggers, Los Angeles Review of Books, and Social Text, where he's part of the editorial collective. Iyko Day is Associate Professor of English and Critical Social Thought at Mount Holyoke College, and faculty member in the 5-college Asian Pacific American Studies program. Her research focuses on Asian North American literature and visual culture, settler colonialism and racial capitalism, Marxist theory, and queer of color critique. She's the author of Alien Capital, Asian Racialization and the Logic of Settler Colonial Capitalism, Duke University Press 2016, and co-edits the book series Critical Race, Indigeneity, and Relationality for Temple University Press. Her current project examines nuclear colonialism in North America, Africa, and Asia, and the aesthetics of racial capitalism. Jigna Desai is Professor of Gender, Woman, and Sexuality Studies and Asian American Studies at the University of Minnesota. She did her graduate education at MIT in Cognitive Science, Earth, Atmospheric, and Planetary Sciences, Astrophysics, English Literature, and Women's Studies. The free-range framework of undergraduate education created an exposure and openness to different ways of knowing and translating across disciplines and fields. This left her with a curiosity about the intellectual engagements that are cross-institutional institutional and seek to restructure knowledge within from the position as a feminist. As a professor in the Department of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies and the Asian American Studies program at the University of Minnesota, she holds affiliations with the Departments of American Studies, Asian Languages and Literature, and Cultural Studies and Comparative Literature, as well as at the Interdisciplinary Center for Global Change, the Race, Indigeneity, Gender, and Sexuality Studies Collective, Film Studies and Moving Image Studies, and the Center for Bioethics. Her research spans media and cultural studies, transnational and post-colonial feminisms, disability studies, Asian American race and immigration studies, and critical sexuality and queer studies. She's the co-director of the Minnesota Youth Story Squad, a university K-12 partnership that deploys feminist, queer, and critical race studies curriculum, digital media making, and undergraduate mentoring in underserved public schools in Minneapolis and St. Paul. Currently, this organization is collaborating on a project called Lake Street Breathe, documenting and narrating the impact of breath and its barriers, environmental racism, COVID health disparities, the murder of George Floyd, and police violence, as well as a subsequent mutual aid on the inhabitants of Minneapolis. Within the university with her colleagues, she has pushed back and succeeded against austerity measures that have tried to collapse and eradicate 6 interdisciplinary units: American Indian Studies, African American and African Studies, Asian American Studies, Chicano and Latino Studies, American Studies, and Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies twice, once as the director of Asian American Studies and once as the chair of GWIZ. She writes with her colleague Kevin Murphy about this experience in an essay called Subjunctively Inhabiting the University, published in the Journal of Critical Ethnic Studies. The last attempt led them to found the Solidarity Space of the Race, Indigeneity Center and Sexuality Studies Initiative, but she has no illusions. It was really undergraduate and graduate organizing, occupation of the president's office, and the subsequent arrests that made the real difference. She's also served within the faculty senate and roles within faculty governance. These experiences have provided a comprehensive understanding of the liberal university's racialized logics, policies, and practice. She much prefers hanging out with the middle school youth than administration, but acknowledges that both are brutal in different ways. Thank you so much to our panelists, and we look forward to listening to them now.
So thank you so much, Faith, for that wonderful introduction. And I can barely contain my excitement to be here with you, with your team at GCWS, Boston-based consortium that's such a vibrant intellectual community. I'm so happy to be here with you, with Kareem and your team, Stacy. Thank you everyone for the warm hospitality. I'm also really excited to be in conversation with 2 of my favorite thinkers, Jigna, Desai, and Iyko. So much has changed since last March when this panel was originally planned. You know, the myriad protest movements emblematized by #Occupy, #Black Lives Matter, #MeToo, migrant rights in the US, anti-colonial and anti-austerity protests in Puerto Rico and Chile, the Umbrella and Arab Spring movements across Hong Kong, North Africa and the Middle East, not to mention the fallout from the global COVID-19 pandemic and the raging fires on the West Coast, all point to the global entanglements of crisis and catastrophe. I'm particularly interested in today's conversation to think through the queer stakes and the stakes of academic feminism in the quote-unquote crisis consensus that folks like Abigail Boggs and Nick Mitchell in their review of 6 books in the field of critical university studies recently coined. And they encourage us to disabuse ourselves that the university is the site of rescue or salvific functions, even as we invest in the basic feminist premise of radical collective social change and how that is possible. So I might be coming to these conversations from left field, but I feel that many of my peers and Jigna and Iyko included are mid-career professors in the academy who are variously chairing, directing, and taking up critical leadership positions. And I'm really interested to think with them and everyone who is listening in. Thank you so much, and good evening to all of you. About how while we're building programs and centers, how can we also simultaneously deprogram and take on anti-programmatic stances and decenter the axes by which institutional coherency and capital are achieved? Questions of institutional reproducibility and contradictions abound around academic feminism today in the neoliberal university. And I think it behooves us to ask if academic feminism is or should be the portal of thinking for thinking otherwise right now? Or should it support alternatives that nonetheless engage feminist analytics and practices? In a constellated model of thinking and practice that are less subservient to structural silos and bolder in its vision of social transformation. So it leads me to then think through some age-old questions about just what kinds of thinking we are promoting, what kinds of blind spots are we not addressing in the US and around the world, and how are transnational analytics of constellated thinking applied in questions of pedagogy and tutelage in our revised curriculum, in our department, in the new program initiatives that we are thinking of, particularly as US satellite campuses continue their uneven establishments overseas in Abu Dhabi, in Singapore, and Shanghai. How might we think through some of these other projects, even as we are concentrated in our energies towards revising and rethinking what's happening here? So while I'm looking to my mid-career peers for this thinking, we might also raise the question of how junior faculty and postdocs can add to this work while securing their tenured future, and how can contingent faculty and contingencies in thinking restructure how we teach. With all these uncertainties in mind, suffice to say in advance that where I find myself often landing is a university of ambivalence, a university of waste, and a university of queer returns. So right now at Dartmouth, I'm working with a very amazing collective of faculty fellows, postdoctoral fellows, staff associates, to create curricular offerings through the Consortium of Studies in Race, Migration, and Sexuality, and we are trying to think through the absence of ethnic studies on campus and the late arrival of ethnic studies on the East Coast, but not in a way that replicates the California model so much as a way to revitalize the field by the constellation of different interdisciplinary approaches to questions of race, migration, and sexuality. And a lot of our peer institutions have been energized in these experimentations, including at Tufts, where the Department of Race, Colonialism, and Diaspora has been established, at Yale, at the Center for Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration, at Barnard, Columbia, the Center for Interdisciplinary Critical Interdisciplinary Studies, at NYU, the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis, and the emergence of many programs across the country, both at the bachelor and the PhD level, including the Race, Indigeneity, and Migration major at the University of Texas, Austin, and at Oregon, a new PhD program. So there's a lot that's happening that behooves us to think about the propulsive force of these different reconfigurations and how we might engage them programmatically. I'd like to think through what Rod Ferguson postulates in his book on the incorporation of minority difference, to think, in terms of these mini revolutions to circumvent corporate absorption, what he calls gestures and routines, and to quote, to re-know with state and capital as interlocutors rather than determinants of university life. In other words, to experiment with ruptural possibilities rather than thinking through their neutralization. I like the way that he theorizes so astutely approaches that are not corrective, but agile responses through imaginative modalities and epistemological registers. He talks very famously of being in but not off the institution. So one of the ways that Rod's thinking has been very central to my work at RMS is figuring out between critique and criticality, how might we configure minor arrangements? In other words, how might we think through these little gestures and routines on the scale of the minoritarian registers, and how could that then lead to other possible ways of organizing our cognate fields, whether they are in the different ethnic studies organization or WGSS, while supporting the defined coordinates and terms of these fields. The question I wanted to repeat here is academic feminism in a position to do this work? And if not, what other ways can we imagine within this constellation of methods that I'm trying to propose as a way? So one of the things that I'm thinking about right now is cataclysmic thinking. And in what follows, I will theorize very briefly what I mean by that. A cataclysm is a, quote, a large-scale and violent event in the natural world, or a sudden violent upheaval, especially in a political and social context, unquote. If we were to enumerate the events and upheavals in 2020 that were and still are cataclysmic, we might find no end in sight. And yet we find ourselves wishing for that moment when things will be restored to normalcy, even the semblance of it. So I was arranging with Hazel Carby about her upcoming senior faculty fellowship at Dartmouth with the consortium I'm directing, and caught myself musing about how the arrangement might have been easier if things were back to normal. To which she exclaimed in exasperation, "Return back to what, Eng-Beng? Who wants that?" Every legitimate queer bone that was left in my constitution crumbled. Now the question is an open one, and here I am regifting it from Carby to you. Back to normal. Who wants that? Now, if durational cataclysm misses the point about the temporalities of crises that are invented by regulatory regimes to administer linear worldviews, views that are often organized by colonial and capitalist logics, can anyone ever seek a time after catastrophe? And what do we mean when we seek for the return of normalcy? What catastrophe? Whose catastrophe? To think through this complicated terrain, I have organized 3 areas of engagement, which I hope to explore during the Q&A. The first is the racial anxieties of academic feminisms. The second is about interdisciplinary calcification and how might we think through the anti-programmatic ethos of radical thinking. The third and fourth are related and point to my investment in queer theorizing. So I'm interested in thinking through constellations of queer in curricular futures. So, and by extension, and to engage with the premise of today's prompt, is there an outside to the temporalities of the neoliberal university and our place in it? Cataclysmic thinking is all about being catalytic while being unchanged by toxic agents and their detritus and debilitations. It is, to paraphrase Rod Ferguson's quotable axiom on institutions, to be in the institution but not of it. This way of thinking is to be in but not of cataclysms. Rather than thinking that there is an endpoint to catastrophes, cataclysmic thinking is a call for a radical force field that imagines and implements change, pushing toward what has not yet been imagined and subjects who have been denied those very imaginations. To do this work, let's first examine the racial anxieties of academic feminism. The bipolar racial anxieties of academic feminism may be summed up, first of all, by the Rachel Dolezals and Jessica Cruz, who love Black women and Latinas so much that they want to be them, and the institutional Karens who, instead of calling the police on Black people for imagined trespassing, violation, and illegalities, activate proceduralism, micromanagement, and white fragility to justify the sense of being trespassed, violated, and made irrelevant by the very presence of thinking women of color and queers of color whose new ideas are deemed exclusionary or not sufficiently respectful of white feminists. The police for institutional Karens is the hand of administrative violence, even as they profess the virtues of multicultural diversity, the way that Jody Malamed articulates it. Their pitchfork-ready politics, like the Dolezals and Cruz, are virtue signaling exercises in anti-racism and boilerplate intersectionalities. The problem of thinking neoliberal university and academic feminism without parsing the differential racial anxieties may actually render the provocative set of interventions convened here in an enmeshment that with no way out. The problem has its origins, has as its origin both colonial designations of race and the trouble with white women. Quote, the trouble with white women, a counter history of feminism, is actually a forthcoming book from the extraordinary mind of Kyla Schuler, who, like Louise Michelle Newman's 1999 monograph, White Women's Rights, The Racial Origins of Feminism in the United States, articulates how white feminism doesn't merely center white women. It is fundamentally an agenda for optimizing white women through dispossessing the more marginalized. The complication here is, of course, its 150-year history of intersectional feminism that interrogates power for the freedom of all. The history of racial cataclysm in white feminism and the racial unconscious of white women who love or hate Black people, who do not see Asians as a race, or who rank oppression based on their own observation, personal relations to marriage or adoption of kids from Africa, East or Southeast Asia, or actual impersonations, as in the case of Dolezal, Crew, Andrea Smith, and others, have huge implications for curricular rearrangements in emerging fields where white women are not central or decentralized, resulting in the delay, drag, obstruction, or cheating of radical thought in action. Program building or curricular reconstitution, the question of resurgent rearrangements and the reorder of methods, histories, and critical adjacencies bring us back to the question of interdisciplinary futures, where we imagine critical landings that engage but also fundamentally exceed how we teach before COVID-19 and the summers of 2015, 16, 17, 18, 19, and 2020. If not then, where is there? The question of interdisciplinary classification and the structural silos of studies is something that is quite a riddle for us to solve in terms of thinking through what are the political and curricular futures of rearranging studies, whether they are Asian American studies, African American studies, Latinx studies, Native American studies, or WGSS. The question that I am wrestling with is how might we think through coalitional and solidarity models, the convergence of these studies into a reconstellated project which takes as its gambit directed epistemic, topical, or institutional rearrangements of ideas, histories, practices, and critiques that may help revivify an idea or a field. Are we beholden to a field to the extent that we cannot think outside of that field? Or is there a way in which we can engage the limitations, orientations, and blind spots of the structural silos created by institutional neoliberal corporate logics, and to open up this question that is larger than disciplinary limitations or interdisciplinary possibilities. The dyad between disciplinary and interdisciplinary binary is often held to the detriment of queer critique. So I'm going to end pretty soon. I just want to recap how curricular futures I began with a few basic premises to locate the problems within what feminists have advocated as situated knowledge. And I think that is a very important point of departure for thinking about what kinds of curricular rearrangements for the future we can imagine when we come together across the different siloed structures. The diagnoses of these pressure points around situated knowledge may point to the ways in which situatedness is now a situation and needs to be reconfigured so that we might be able to advance different ways of thinking that takes into account all of these tensions and pressure points. Between the tensions of academic cooperation and minority incorporation, between the politics of critique and criticality, how does radical thought look like, sound like today, and how can it be put to action? Something as simple as cataclysmic thinking with queer, feminist, and anti-racist minor arrangements may be the answer for now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone, or good evening. I also want to begin by thanking Faith, Elora, Stacy, Tina, Badria, and everyone else for helping to organize this panel. I'm really so honored to be in conversation with Eng-Beng Lim and Jigna Desai. I'm also really grateful to the audience for making the time to be here tonight with us. A lot of the points that Eng-Beng raised are ones I share. In particular, I think the one about being a mid-career professor, a scholar who, we're really in the center of trying to build things while understanding sort of our strange place in relation to the neoliberal operations of colleges and universities. So I hope that I'm looking forward to engaging in more of this conversation in the Q&A, especially around kind of thinking about questions about how we conceive of solidarity in a profession where like 75% are non-tenure track, what we really think about in terms of the role of critique, the professional individuation of scholars, how we want to think about promotion structures. This is a time, I think, where we can really reimagine things, hopefully on a better, with a new kind of future in mind. Okay, so that being said, I've organized my comments tonight to think through my position as a scholar who's really devoted to building critical race and ethnic studies at my own institution, but also understanding the context of university operations that Abigail Boggs and Nick Mitchell refer to as accumulation by education. And this is a phrase they use to illustrate the university's role as a mechanism of privatization and as a destructive agent of neoliberalism. So this isn't really like a recent phenomenon that coincides with the neoliberal turn in the late 1970s. Rather, it's important to recognize that the colonial theft and racialized expropriation have structured the university since its inception. The first colleges founded in the 16th and 17th centuries required the dispossession of indigenous lands and the labor of enslaved people. The passage of the Morrill Act in 1868 allocated over 17 million acres 17 million acres of stolen indigenous land to jumpstart a new era in the public university system that, with very few exceptions, excluded Black people. So, taking again the long view, COVID-19 is also not the cause for the current crisis in colleges and universities. Rather, it has really shined a light or exposed the evisceration of higher education in the neoliberal era, which I think was, kickstarted by Ronald Reagan's proposal to begin charging tuition in the UC system in retaliation to Vietnam and anti-McCarthyism protesters at Berkeley while he was the governor of California. And it actually now seems like a distant memory that in California and New York, public colleges used to be free, which of course mostly benefited white men. But my point here is that I think it's important to recall that before the pandemic hit, higher education really hadn't recovered from the disastrous effects of the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis. So in 2019, just a little while ago, 1,000 private colleges were borderline insolvent, including the college that's in my consortium, Hampshire College, and state funding for higher education really didn't return to pre-recession levels. Meanwhile, the looming enrollment cliff that is the result of declining birth rates, which is also another consequence of the Great Recession, will mean that many institutions will face plummeting student enrollment in just a few years. Finally, bipartisan gutting of the humanities and liberal arts education threatens to turn all of our institutions into vocational STEM factories, which require huge capital investments for labs, computers, and high-end equipment. So this business-oriented ideology has really reached kind of grotesque proportions, to the extent that in 2012, Governor Rick Scott of Florida proposed charging students more tuition if they majored in non-STEM fields. So the corollary to state disinvestment in higher education has been the prison boom. As just one example, California currently spends 6 times as much to lock up one person in prison than to educate one college student. In the recent wildcat strikes at UC Santa Cruz, organized by graduate students protesting for a living wage, the University of California retaliated by arresting 17 protesters and firing 82 graduate student instructors, who then lost their health care during the pandemic, in the midst of the pandemic. So, and I think an important detail is that UC Santa Cruz spent $300,000 a day for campus security during this strike, which over the course of a month was more than triple the amount that graduate students were demanding, for a living wage. So this is clearly one context that gives rise to a question posed by Abigail Boggs, Eli Meyerhoff, Nick Mitchell, and Zach Schwartz-Weinstein in their invitation to what they call abolitionist university studies. And their question is, are prisons and universities two sides of the same coin? And so I'll set that aside for now. So for those of us working in critical race and ethnic studies, how are we also complicit in the university's ongoing accumulation by education? As we instill in our students feminist, queer, decolonial, and abolitionist critical frameworks, the college exploits the cruel optimism students invest in our institutions while turning racial justice or Black Lives Matter into a brand. As Boggs and Mitchell lay out, and this is something they say, to work in the university today is to be implicated both in the reproduction of such fantasies and the epistemologies of forgetting that subtend them. The racial dynamics of accumulation, I think, come into full view of fullest relief when we confront the reality of racialized debt subjection. Reactionary politicians like Ronald Reagan promoted student debt as a means of suppressing social movements and disciplining individuals as colleges became Blacker, browner, and more working class. The result is that students of color are further disadvantaged by their lack of inherited wealth due to Jim Crow, dispossession, and citizenship status. So as many of you know, student debt has now reached 1.7 trillion, increasing over 160% since the height of the subprime mortgage crisis. So this is a very recent kind of phenomenon. Figured as a form of good debt, student loans are the only type of consumer loan that cannot be cleared through bankruptcy. And that is something that we can thank Joe Biden for. As Annie McClanahan has shown, $150 billion of this debt is held by high interest private lenders. 45% of the people who take out private loans qualify for federal loans, which is the same percentage of people who took out subprime loans, even though they were eligible for prime rates. So similar to the sort of predatory lenders of the subprime mortgage crisis, high interest private student loans are disproportionately targeted at low income students of color. So this is really a mirror of the subprime mortgage market. This kind of debt accumulation, which relies on and exploits, again, this cruel optimism students invest in higher education, is a profitable business that also shares key attributes with the subprime mortgage industry. As McClanahan lays out, public loans are also securitized, refinanced, and bundled together into student loan asset-backed securities, which are then tranched and sold to institutional investors, including many pension funds. This means that it's actually possible for a professor at a university to be indirectly invested in the debt of their own students. The university and the credit economy, therefore, kind of hand in hand in the process of accumulation by education. And as the student debt crisis illuminates, these encoded privileges are reproduced and heightened through the exploitation of racialized economic disparities. While wealthy white students expand their exclusive entitlements to upward mobility, often through bribery, fraud, which the recent Varsity Blues scandal kind of exposed, as well as through the recruitment of conservative Asian American proxies, which the anti-affirmative case at Harvard kind of revealed. What we have as the result is that poor students and students of color have really become the kind of raw material for the financialization of education. In the neoliberal university, the value of the latter of these poor students is their capacity to be indebted. Debt forecloses on the future of poor students and students of color through economic subjection that in turn renders them reliant, much more reliant than in the past, on their parents and on their family structures. And I think that Melinda Cooper, who wrote a book on, I think it's family values, makes this great point that this mode of privatization really reinforces the power of the heteropatriarchal family and the ideology of family responsibility. So I want to close kind of in the spirit of these nationwide protests that have called for the abolition of policing in prisons in response to the police murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and countless unnamed others. So following the lead of abolitionist university studies, it seems that the question is not whether the neoliberal university will survive or a question of how we can save it, but rather how can we ensure that its current operational structure of accumulation by education is abolished? But how do we get there? And what does abolition mean in this instance? For Dylan Rodriguez, abolition is generative, not negative. And he describes it as something that's inseparable from its roots in feminist and queer Black liberation and feminist and queer Indigenous anti-colonialism and decolonization. Or as Fred Moten and Stefano Harney offer, they say that an abolitionist university would be kind of like an abolitionist prison or an abolitionist plantation. They write that it would be where the generation of knowledge in the university at the level of its form, content, and practices tends towards the knowing degeneration, disorganization, and disequilibrium of the university. So for those of us working in feminist and queer studies, critical race and ethnic studies, I hope we can think together about how to mobilize this generative abolitionist project and to consider the forms of political solidarity we can build using this lens within and beyond the university. So thank you.
Thank you.
I'm so happy to be here with you all. Thank you for taking the time this evening to attend. And I want to thank all of you in terms of the conversations that we're having, because I think that, on a Thursday evening, there's ways in which the conversations, there are other places you could be, but I think this is important for us to be here together. I want to also thank Faith, Stacy, Eng-Beng, Kareem, Iyko, and Badria for all that they've done, and Alora for putting this together and bringing so much vision to the conversation. I want to say that I've spent the last 28 years at the University of Minnesota, first as a graduate student and as a faculty. And my comments are kind of thinking about place-based knowledge in the ways in which we engage these issues. I've been through, I think, 3 or 4 failed union drives, a few recessions, several attempts at unit erasures and collapse, numerous student occupations of president's offices, and have been paying attention to the ways in which the calls for abolition, decolonizing the university continue to play out in land theft spaces like the University of Minnesota, which is a land theft state university and had its largest campuses in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. And the University of Minnesota campuses and the state on traditional ancestor and contemporary lands of 11 Native tribes. And the Twin Cities campus in particularly is on Dakota land that was ceded in 1837 and 1851. These conditions and histories continue to shape the present university, its complicities and responsibilities to Indigenous people. And the university has a particularly enmeshed relationship in not only in thinking about aspects of land, but also the ways it played out in modalities of medical racism, biocolonialism, agrocolonialism, for example, the patenting of wild rice, educational racism, policing and incarceration. And the campus is located just a few miles from where not only George Floyd was murdered, but also Jamar Clark and Philando Castile. And so this is a site where people have been taking to the streets, part of uprisings and mutual aid. So this kind of place-based feeling that I have is coming from the urgency of the moment in so many ways that is very much surrounding the university geographically and conceptually. So in these ways, the location of the university that is so part of the racial and disability related health disparities around COVID as well. We've been thinking a lot, and I think there have been so many conversations around disaster academic capitalism and the ways in which that's playing out. For example, the University of Michigan students who are on strike right now have a set of demands that are trying to very much articulate the ways in which the neoliberal university and the corporate university are enacting austerity yet again in their strategies and inviting students back to campus despite state warnings, expelling students for social violations and keeping their tuition. They're very concrete strategies that they're deploying to transfer the risk and the cost again upon the very lives of students who are returning to the university that then again blames them for that return and their irresponsible behavior. Placing staff, especially contingent vulnerable staff, on unnecessary frontline and dangerous positions, enforcing in-person teaching, disregarding vulnerabilities. And after having told students for decades that their customers in education is a commodity, the chickens have come home to roost in that sense, in the ways that students now demand refunds, particularly using the same language that the university has sold to them for so long. So this neoliberal risk management has dominated the strategies of higher education and COVID response. And the disaster academic capitalism continues to always enact upward redistribution towards these kinds of STEM versions of what the university will be, and continues to force participation in the death cult of academic capitalism. And yet the parts of the university we inhabit might be better thought of as part of the nonprofit industrial complex. We inhabit these spaces that are tax-free institutions that seek to do good in their own ways. And the way critical ethnic studies, feminist studies have been institutionalized and at the same time function often like nonprofits in these ways that work against the larger logics in which wild rice is being patented or medical racism is being enacted. And I think the responses that have been happening in many places, from the UC strikes to early demands of UMN grad students that were around furloughs and protection, but also the Accessible Campus Action Alliance that released a statement on beyond high risk, on ethical behavior that was not fiscal centric, as they put it, that did not purport the cult of academic capitalism, death capitalism, and the vulnerability that it articulated around the ways in which vulnerability was being institutionalized and seen as not as an exceptional category, that one had to prove one's vulnerability through documentation, that the ways in which the disposability of all workers was at the heart of the operations around COVID. And currently the grad students in Michigan who are striking and are demanding, again, straightforward and expansive, but don't address the larger, I think, context that we're talking about entirely, but they're demanding robust plans for testing, contact tracing, and campus safety, graduate employees, a universal right to work remotely without documentation, care subsidy regardless of a care provider, cancellation of fees for international students, a demilitarized workplace, and defunding of police. And there's more that we must do. Being at a university that has for a long time done the work of austerity politics in refunding from smaller units to STEM, and done the work of making its political economy of budgets invisible, so that the kind of expansive real estate foundation, expensive legal cost police force of the neoliberal university, that work is invisible to most of us. Those costs and benefits are hidden. We are able to focus on other issues like reparations and repair and redress for in the abolition mode around slavery and settler colonialism, but the other demands around the use of HeLa cells, around medical racism and testing, contribution to health disparities, holding the university responsible to those is still work that needs to be done. The extraction of culture, we're a large urban university that recruits people by talking about the diversity of the area. And yet the communities of color are often disenfranchised from the very university itself, which is policing its borders and issuing warrants and warnings in regard to dangerous men and security threats. So the ways in which, and I will say, for example, our highly ranked and funded sociology department that has a huge criminal law and deviant subsection where several of the officers responsible for Floyd's death received their degrees there. So that contradiction of how and what we do in a certain way. But those complicities are beyond just calling out other parts of the university. And that complicity, I think, of being in or of the university and that distinction that's being made, I think we inhabit a kind of space in which the subjunctive university, the one that is not yet here, the one that is yet to be, the one that we speak of in the conditional sense, has been the kind of space that feminist and critical race scholars have tried to occupy. And in that same place, we inhabit a mood that's hypothetical, imagined, dreaded, wished for, and uncertain. It is ambivalent, I think, as Eng-Beng was saying. It is not one of an attachment of a cruel optimism. So in that sense, if we try to think about the ways in which our work must continue in decolonizing and calling for abolition, that we continue to need to think about settler colonialism, land grant missions, the sovereignty of subjects and knowledge within the university, that fields like Asian American studies offer us opportunities to think about what it means to belong illegitimately, what it means to, in fact, continue to refuse to belong, inhabit and know within the university. The fact that I haven't been to a university in over 6 months, changes that sense of inhabitation. But rather than seeking institutionalization, I think, as Eng-Beng was saying, if we're speaking away from the silo model, or even the claim that as academic feminism allows interdisciplinarity and allows either scavenging or it allows border crossings, we might want to think less about disciplines in that sense and think about the ways we're bad disciplinary scholars, that we're doing disdisciplinary work in our queer methodologies. Not that we are just picking up the tools that are available to us through scavenging, but to be a disdisciplinary scholars means that we think about the fact that we are poor thinkers in certain ways, but we are nevertheless committed to do it. We disidentify, coming back to the work of Jose Esteban Munoz and Chela Sandoval, who think about disidentification in a particular way that I think serves as a model for thinking about disdisciplinarity, that we may want to produce knowledge through and in relation to other forms of knowledge, but not that it's oppositional or enclosed. It's both failure and emergent. And it's a failure that is a failure to fully assimilate, to produce disciplinary knowledge or create a discipline or an interdiscipline in which we want to reside permanently. And in the way that I think the kind of practice of disciplinarity is that if we disidentify with the relations of our own methodologies, how might we reimagine our very relationships to knowledge productions as subjects through remaking intimately in slutty ways and promiscuous ways and ways that are maybe temporary. I have to say, in this moment, I feel like I have to know everything and I know nothing. We have to know epidemiology. We have to know, I can't even think of all the things we have to know for a certain degree, but to think about the ways in which that the work that is demanded means that there isn't just a claiming of an institutional space. In fact, that we're working against that. And if that institutionalization is an attachment to cruel optimism, Kevin Murphy and I were asking, what does it mean if we desire buen vivre, to live well or even live well enough, to think about survival in a certain set of networks of care and intellectual labor. And I think care in particular, that the care labor of mutual aid, the care labor of taking care of each other, the care labor of infrastructure that allows sustenance and makes life bearable in this moment is very ambivalent, it's uneven, and it's incoherent. And so if our queer methodologies lead to us to be disdisciplinary, if they lead us to be not just ambivalent, but even emergent failures in certain ways, but incoherent at certain times, I would say even from fatigue. I'm exhausted many, many days. The labor we are doing is very much feminist care labor, but in very queer ways. And it might be that the kinds of networks that we're setting up now are exactly the things that lead to survival. Maybe not to our institutionalization, but I think survival might be the more important part. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these presentations. I mean, they're just, my head is buzzing as we've been hearing about waiting for normalcy and cataclysmic thinking. All of you really asking us to think about what it means to be placed in relation to the institution, whether that's about how these institutions were established in the first place. In other words, a kind of immoral clearing of land in order to install the institution, or whether it's the adjacency of the university to the brutality, the police brutality that was happening this summer, or as the last presentation just pointed out, the way in which the institution is training officers in that brutality and so on. We heard about revitalizing without replicating and so on. I'd like to give the panelists a chance, first of all, to put questions to each other or comments to each other, and then soon after that to turn to the audience. Thank you very much. No? Maybe later. So I'm going to go ahead and I guess read the questions in the Q&A then. From Daniel Agate, a question about the relationship between academics and the administration, which is much like that between a firm and the managers. Have any of you done work in thinking through how alternative or generative, to use Iyko's word, for how alternative forms of the university might be built from the ground up that sidesteps administration and focuses simply on the teaching relationship between professors and students? That's interesting because all of you in some ways were talking about alternatives, that tension between being alternative within, acting within, but also coming up with alternative ways to imagine what we do.
I could take a quick stab at this. I am, I'm serving in a university-wide committee for a chief diversity officer search at my college. And I was struck by the prompt in the webinar around how what if the neoliberal university is not in fact antithetical to our goals or practices as feminists and principal social actors in the institution? That was one of the questions that was posed. And I remember at at the meeting for this chief diversity officer search, I was very interested to think about precisely the connection between a position, an administrative position like this, and academics. How might a chief diversity officer change the culture and engage the transformative social justice ethos that's being imagined by the trustees of the college as well as the president's office? How might they even present a corrective, even as we are not interested in correctives? How might they think through correction of wrongs that are difficult to engage from a purely administrative point of view or from a academic point of view? It seems that the two things are set in contradistinction to each other. So for instance, would this empowered position, which is a vice president kind of position, change the culture in departments that are recalcitrant around this question of diversity? How might the ways that some departments are not invested in some of these hiring practices that are diverse be persuaded to think otherwise? I mean, these questions are are very provocative in terms of how we might understand administration vis-a-vis academics, and how those two components have become so bifurcated that is almost a set of logics that is set in opposition to each other. So I'm really interested in this question that was posed around how scholars and thinkers might imagine those subjunctive spaces that Jigna posed in her wonderful remarks, that are not there. How can administrative thinking also, engage in these kinds of less over-determined outcomes around the success of diversity, inclusion, and equity, and imagine with queer practices and thinking ways of disidentifying and not belonging, ways of being, of ways of experimenting with form that will not be assimilated into corporate university culture, that will promote less competitive, divisionary, divisive spheres where departments and units are competing for majors and competing for resources. How can we change that set of thinking with radical queer feminist investments? I mean that's a question that is an open question for all of us to think about intervening in different ways, because there's no one answer to how you might correct or change the culture. But are there specific kinds of interventions that you could do through your program, through your position as a director, through your position as a graduate student and so forth, to imagine some kind of gesture, some kind of ritual, some kind of some ways of thinking that will be alternative to the always already implemented and imagined?
Yeah, I just want to add the other model I think of is like a cooperative, right? Like I have to do my shift. And so if we ran universities without administrators, but we all had to do our administrative shift we sign up for, that might be an interesting model, is a kind of cooperative worker-owned university. So the faculty, the instructors, the staff who work there, it's not a career position in that way. You all have to do your work. And there's a way in which, I'm being slightly facetious, but at the same time, shifting the model from a consumer to and even the worker co-op model still suggests we're selling something, right? That doesn't get at the kind of heart of the question around how do we reimagine the university. I mean, I think we make it free, we make it accessible, we change who can be there. And then we change who, the kind of boundaries between instructor, staff, and student, right? That I think that has to be a lot of the work. But specifically in thinking about administration, how we do it, I think we have to take up those reins in different ways, but they can't be career placements. And I think that might shift the way we do it. I did my job as chair. I stepped up to do chair. And then I felt like the neoliberal hand of the university within the department. But we decided what we were going to refuse to do. I mean, like thinking very concretely, I refused to, okay, we will skip this metric. When we have to submit the memo on which metrics we want to be judged by, we're going to skip that memo. That the refusal to do work was a strategy that we deployed. But I think you have to come in into these positions rethinking, as I think Daniela Gatti is asking, if we do want to think of it as a place of work, then what are the different ways that organization happens in those? And I know there's movements right now to organize across universities, but also across categories. So it's staff with students, with faculty, and I think, and including contingent faculty, and those kinds of alliances and solidarities have to be built and work in order to reimagine.
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe just piggyback on that comment, and because I'm just, the name of the institution is escaping me, but there are examples in the United States of small colleges that got rid of their board of trustees and their administration and did turn to like a worker co-op model. In fact, when Hampton College was on the verge of insolvency and sort of they were on the brink of disaster. Last year, the students, occupied the president's office for, I think, months. It was, and they were actively organizing a worker co-op model. And that would mean that, the distinctions between contingent, faculty, and staff, everyone would would actually be a democracy. And so, I think that those are definitely, practical ways that we can actually turn to and look at concrete examples of how that actually really shifts the way that power is distributed. And then the emphasis gets shifted from sort of administration distributing these, these resources to really everyone kind of working to share needs. So the emphasis becomes really different in terms of what you're doing and how you're what kind of mode of relation you are with other people. I've just been reading Stefano Harney and Fred Moten's work. There have been a slate of articles calling, for the end of the university or the university's last word. These kind of thinking through kind of just the demise of this current structure. And they just they say, I just found this quotation, which I think is kind of apropos of the question, fuck sharing governance, or a slightly more equitable distribution of extracted surplus. They say, let's share needs. And then, they're like, why should we want to lower administrative salaries rather than eliminate administration? Defund the police isn't the same as fuck the police. So, and they go on. But again, I'm often struck by these tensions, particularly as I have, like Jigna been in a chair's role. I've actually also served on, number of college-wide committees. So I see both sides of it, but there's something just soul sucking about the administrative side of it to me. And so I just, I'm interested. What I'm not interested in is how increasingly we have business interests determining our curriculum. I think in particular, we're seeing this particularly with the rise of STEM, because, tech companies don't want to train their own employees. It's too expensive. So they kind of offload that and put economic pressure on all of our institutions to actually provide that education, even though it's far more expensive than the English department or our interdisciplinary programs in many ways are subsidizing that expense for these STEM programs. I could say more about that, but I'm not trying to hate on STEM. I'm just saying that there's something corrupt when faculty don't get to have a real voice in determining and shaping the curriculum.
That touches on one of the questions has to do with what we mean when we say abolish the university, and how a call for abolition of the university is or isn't like the call, say, to abolish prisons.
If I can take a stab at this, and I welcome other comments. I think that to me, reading through this work, and grappling with a number of graduate students who have increasingly come to call the university a plantation or describe it as a plantation in terms of the ways that it serves as a site that that reproduces the structures of violence in our society, and it's a space through which a vast amount of capital actually moves. In order to consolidate other sort of, projects. And many of the universities, including Jigna, the fact that we're educating, the police forces, et cetera, we're also, our 401ks are invested in, extractive industries and in the occupation of Palestine, et cetera, et cetera. So, I think that the question is how do we define abolition? And so this is where I think that, Ruthie Gilmore has really, and Angela Davis, they talk about abolition democracy, and where they locate abolition, specifically thinking about W.E.B. Du Bois's work, in thinking about Reconstruction, how it was actually, they frame the development of Black schools, of the public school system itself as abolition, right? It's not the end of slavery, or the formal end of slavery was not abolitionist. It was actually the creation of these public schools that was abolitionist. And so thinking about the creative, the generative aspects of abolition, I think is what I think, rather than saying it's like an end to something, I think the feminist kind of, what we learned from feminist research is that actually you don't have to end things. It's not the end, you know, it's not all about destruction. It's about the sort of creating something new, right? And letting the other thing just die. And also, I think, you know, trying to be a handmaiden into that sort of, into that demise. But I mean, at the same time, we're seeing, as I mentioned before, you know, public and private nonprofit universities are not in a good place right now. Before the pandemic, it's been a crisis. And so there are many things that are contributing to the place that we're in now.
Okay. And I think also by extension, if we think about abolitionism in the programmatic or curricular sense, how might we apply this question that's entrenched in the political economy of the university toward what we do as university professors? That is to say, how can we abolish some of these frameworks that have structured both disciplinary and interdisciplinary thinking, and to create an opening where we could credential the kinds of alternative learning and experiential learning, whether it is through the co-op or through street canvassing and organizing, and credential these kinds of activities as valued, you know, teaching apparatuses, as valued part of the value of a liberal arts education, and to very deliberately turn students away from the professionalizing credentials of internships at, you know, Wall Street firms and other such companies, and to give value to students who are thinking in less conventional, less professional terms. How could we do that? By rethinking the curricular requirements of our programs, and to find coalitions across various you know, programs and centers and institutes that are willing to reconstitute and rethink what we do, so that we are not bound by the studies model and limit students to just one area, and without having a more a broader view of what is at stake when they cross these different silos and think in comparative terms.
I hope that that is a way of responding to Keisha Carnel's question about the relationship between the neoliberal push to have students self-identify scholars and the degree to which faculty are being managed by the neoliberal university, but also an earlier comment from Naomi Shaman, how should we balance the struggles for institutional legitimacy and stability to do the work, and on the one hand, and support students' aspirations on the one hand, and the more radical visions that you were also compellingly articulating. I believe that some of these answers are in that direction. Here's a question. I'm sorry, I'm not going in order. Here's a question. What teaching practices do you use in the classroom to establish counter spaces, if this is even a possibility? This is from Robert Morris Levine.
Well, one of the things that we've been doing with Youth Story Squad is working with middle school and high school students, trying to get ethnic studies, feminist studies, and queer studies to them as they're in that stage of identity development, intellectual development, and don't have access to often these ways of thinking beside the internet in a more formalized way. So our undergraduates actually mentor and work with K through 12 students in a model where we're there in the classroom with the 8th grade students, for example, once a week, doing workshops and lessons on using the pedagogy of the oppressed, using media making, using digital media, and for them to advocate for the social justice issues that are for them. So we think a lot about praxis. What do they want? How is it that the work that they're doing doesn't live within the university, but it lives elsewhere? Where and how are they already part of conversations? And any student that enters, usually I would say into a feminist studies classroom says, I wish I'd learned this earlier. I wish I had known about this. Why wasn't I told? And so we give them that opportunity as a pedagogical practice, but as a kind of praxis of what classroom work is, what it means. And it's not a savior model, because I tell them these middle school students know far more than you do in what they have to say about their experiences, about the world, and so on. You can't tell 8th graders a lot of things. And so there is a way in which transformation of the kinds of ways our pedagogies matter. The project we're doing now called Lake Street Breathe, and I feel like I have turned from doing the work of administration, faculty governance, sharing all of that, to creating models that I find create moments of what I'm hoping are survivability, and thinking about how to do imaginative and speculative work elsewhere. And so currently the Lake Street Breathe is looking and integrates high school, undergraduate and graduate students who are documenting, doing photography, doing videography of Lake Street as the spine that runs through South Minneapolis, where the uprisings have taken place, and are documenting, gathering stories of mutual aid, survival experience around themes of breath and its barriers. And so why can't people breathe, and what allows people to breathe, and however they understand that. And so to create these alternative assignments that are assignments, but they're projects, and to see that for them, the way they can't be in school, but they're on the street with us doing photography with photography mentors. They're on the street having conversations from different parts of and neighborhoods of North and South Minneapolis. North Minneapolis has been a predominantly Black neighborhood that is very much underserved and was not so much in the news, but what the experiences are like within the different schools there. And South Minneapolis isn't by any means wealthy, but there are pockets, and it's it's very different. So just even having these conversations of what it means to be there, and these undergraduates are and the graduate students are helping do public humanities work. The photography exhibit will be in the parking lot that is empty. And so spaces will be in the public spaces. So thinking very differently about where our work has to be, especially when all of it is happening remotely in this moment, and how our work has to be and for whom. So they're documenting their mutual aid, and the public work will be in parking lots or parks, public libraries, if and when they open, in ways projected on the side of buildings. It will be in the spaces that are in the city itself. So thinking pedagogically very differently about our possibilities as well.
Ronak Capadio, why are there no non-tenured or adjunct casualized workers represented on this panel about neoliberalism and the university? So as an organizer responding to that, in other words, I'm being challenged to think about how we have reproduced a certain hierarchy and so on in terms of the very topic that we've convened to kind of think through. So this is something to think about, especially I'm thinking about the way in which, for example, convening panels such as this take us always to institutional affiliations in particular ways, and within those institutional structures to particular levels of accomplishment, accreditation, and so on. And I think, so the question is really kind of pushing me to kind of think through that, to think about that.
Mm-hmm.
Another question about tenure track and tenured faculty, Kareem is asking, how do we think about tenure track, tenured faculty responsibility to precarious labor at the university? What are the opportunities for tenure track and tenured faculty to advocate for protest or shift new labor relations in the university?
Hey, do you mind just repeating the question? I'm just trying to. Oh, I think you're muted.
I want to link it actually to the question just before. So why are there no non-tenured or adjunct casualized workers represented on this panel about neoliberalism in the university? And then how do we think about tenure track and tenure faculty's responsibility to precarious labor at the university? What are the opportunities to advocate for, protest, or shift new labor relations in the university? This is to say, not from the administration, but what are the opportunities for tenure track and tenured faculty to do that advocacy and do that shifting?
I mean, I can say maybe two things about that. I think that first, the vast disparities in status on a college campus between full professors, associate professors, and the whole structure which is extremely hierarchical, is the way that I think is a way that we are sort of we perpetuate that kind of system, and the way that promotion works in that hierarchical structure makes it very, very difficult for us to organize. And actually, and so which leads to the second point, which is that if all faculty, regardless of rank, were to organize and have solidarity with one another, that would be the most powerful form of leverage one would have at the university. But again, the hierarchy that's so ingrained in the culture of academia is what always, really thwarts it. And we've all probably had some sort of experience with this very question, just in the spring. I certainly did. People, as Smith College here, fired all of their visiting faculty. Rutgers, NYU, CUNY, got, fired or laid off so many faculty and staff also. So faculty and staff and contingent labor, if they were all, if there were a sort of block, that would actually be the most powerful form of leverage one could have. But again, it's the culture, I think, that of the institution and that sort of ingrained sense of hierarchy that really always seems to thwart that.
Naomi Shaman in the chat section notes that at the University of Minnesota, there was an attempt to unionize all faculty together, tenure track, and contingent, but that it was defeated by the administration's successful effort to split the groups. So that's speaking to that point. Yeah.
And as someone at a private college, we are unable to, we're supposed, if there's some law written somewhere that we're not allowed to unionize because we're considered management. So it's a bizarre sort of system. I don't quite understand it, but those are the reasons that are always given. I mean, we're all, of course, have our chapters of the AAUP, but that hasn't really, I mean, but it's a very limited form of, structured solidarity.
I think the broader question is also to what extent faculty have the power to intervene in many of these labor practices. Faculty control curriculum. I mean, that's the piece that, you know, of the university that we have the most, where we have the most agency. So the question is, can a curricular and programmatic rethinking that incorporates contingent precarious labor differently help us better integrate the disparities, or better, you know, address this question of disparity? Because you know, the power of the faculty to intervene in the university's financial structure, relative to the faculty's power to change and think through curriculum. There are two different things, right? So is there a way that we can intervene through a terrain where we have more power? That's a really provocative question, and a difficult one to think through. And I hope that the more that we can think about, you know, curricular and programmatic interventions, the more we can, you know, better integrate contingent faculty.
Cameron Paro, given the priority structure that raises STEM and diminishes non-STEM fields for the sake of extraction and capital generation, what does a hypothetical radical abolitionist STEM scholar or faculty look like?
One who majors in women's gender and sexuality studies, or is open to rearranging their, you know, their studies so that they incorporate unconventional areas and analytics and practices and internships, something that goes way beyond the well-trodden path of professionalization, something that, you know, opens them up to critiques, interventions, practices, subjunctive spaces, indeterminacies, and contingencies that are not fixed, that helps to you know, unravel the assumptions that they have about what constitutes success, and to think through, you know, the premises of liberal arts education more deeply as an engagement with you know, social movements, with queer encounters, and with many other forms of knowledges that are not necessarily recognized institutionally. Like, are they open to those kinds of evidence? Are they open? Are they willing to explore those different ways of being in the world?
And I would think that understanding that scientific knowledge is also socially constructed and produced, and it has its own political economy, and the ways in which it operates now within universities and globally in formations of big science, and the claims in which big science makes to purport truths about the human that are larger and larger, and to be able to be critical of those and be able to engage them using very much the paradigms that Eng-Beng was talking about, and being able to kind of take the ways in which feminist, queer, critical ethnic, and critical science studies understands how knowledge production works, its relationship to power, and the way that capital drives science, and the very notions of human and nature that undergird so much of scientific knowledge. I do work on neural knowledges and the kind of hegemony that they have now on telling us the truth about the human, and the ways that pushing back against that neural knowledge and how we are defined by our brains. Typically, it incorporates, STEM is incorporated into the humanities as a kind of way to legitimate the scientific knowledge. If you think about the way cognitive science has been incorporated into literary studies, for example, or computation analyses, that is how multidisciplinary humanistic science work is considered. But the directionality, I think, needs to be converted, because so much of the ways in which we could think about health, medicine, science, biology, but also physics has groundings in the way the human is conceived, the way nature is conceived, and have hugely capitalist endeavors behind them, right? And if you think about the way that capitalism drives science, that a materialist analysis, but also a kind of a recognition of the dynamics of that are critical to being, I think, a STEM scholar these days as a former scientist.
Yeah, I just want to just add to those wonderful points just by saying that, I mean, in my institution, have been major investments in data science. And I think that one of the things that we can always do is to, I mean, which was really not a lot of, you know, thinking and preparation about what the implications of that data collection would be. And so many of these sort of this data science is directed towards, or a portion of it at least is towards, you know, predictive algorithms for use in policing. So that is that is one way that we can think about an abolitionist, you know, critique of that particular form of knowledge making. Similarly, I mean, there's a lot of investment in my college in cognitive science, which, based on the many of the students I've talked to who are engaged in this, and so much of it is about, it seems that it will be co-opted by marketing firms, right? Because they want to know how we think and how Facebook will make us want to buy things. And so just understanding, again, as just to reinforce what Jigna was saying. The other, I mean, maybe in terms of a kind of really practical response to how anyone, STEM or non-STEM, or anyone who's in a university or college, how they can engage in a kind of grow abolitionism on their campus. I just want to direct you to actually a document. It's called How to Grow Abolition on Your Campus, 8 Actions. And so they actually, there's a whole list, you can look it up. I can also try to put it into the chat, but it's about, you know, doing concrete steps to defunding campus police, you know, figuring out radical forms of, you know, community and interdependence, and they're really practical resources and recommendations that I think, you know, are useful for anyone who's interested in doing this this work.
Thank you. A question here from Leanne Liu. What does it mean to be this disciplinary scholar as an undergraduate student? What does it mean to, I guess, disidentify, but as an undergraduate?
I feel like my undergraduate, you know, students have that freedom to be not, it's really the graduate training that demands the kind of monogamy of relationships, right? I think undergraduates get to be slutty is the way I think about it. They get to be going from discipline to discipline. I'm writing about promiscuity as a queer methodology that, you know, that graduate school demands, and graduate training demands that kind of choosing one, that monogamy that is so. But what would it mean to be ethically slutty even as an undergraduate? Like, how is one responsible to the knowledge one produces by thinking about the relationships to subject, object, and the kind of intimacies and accountability that even if it's a hookup or a one-night stand, one is always doing it responsibly. So if I'm engaging with neuroscience, if I'm engaging with epidemiology, I'm still responsible for the knowledge that I produce and how I do it. But I think it's still important to intervene, to participate, to engage in these ways. And so how might we do it as a promiscuity, that it's a mixture, that it's always contaminated, that I am not a pure scholar. And in fact, there is not a purity that we associate with disciplinarity. And so I'm trying to move it from spatial metaphors that have dominated disciplinarity that are much more relational. So if disciplinarity is territorial, that one is a border crossing where we're siloed and interdisciplinary scholars somehow are traversing, or that we might want to think about a different model that has actually always been at the heart of the way we think subject and object knowledge production needs to be questioned as feminists. And that this requires a kind of foray into intimacy as the basis for our methodology. And therefore, promiscuity is the queer method we would want to abide by.
Thank you for the invitation. Sorry to think about it that way. I actually find that undergraduates often advise each other to be disciplinarily monogamous, just as their parents advise them, for reasons I completely understand, especially when there's a lot of anxiety about the workplace. And so I'm thinking about undergraduates in actually in the opposite way, as not being open to come over to our classrooms or whatever it is, because there's no sense of a kind of monetary gain at the end of the journey. So that's what I was thinking.
No, I appreciate that. I think you're right.
Yeah, I agree completely. But I also understand the question from an undergraduate point of view through the rush to fulfill distribution requirements, to declare a major or a minor, the predetermined tracks that they are, guided to follow. So there's a way in which it's hard to imagine otherwise when you are so busy trying to figure out how to graduate and how to be focused on fulfilling requirements to be a major. I think that the idea of promiscuity that Jigna was advocating is a question of method. So I think that if undergraduates engage, in the question of methods and the arsenal of methods available to understand the production of knowledge, then we could talk about how you might be a misfit within a disciplinary regime. You might be a queer, you might be an unorthodox thinker, you might be infidel, you might not quite fit into the neat linear structures of knowledge production within both disciplinary and interdisciplinary majors that require you to think about proper objects and the division between subject and object and so forth. So the question that you might want to generate as a radical thinker at the undergraduate is to keep asking, what is the counter knowledge, or what is a different way of understanding this body of knowledge? How might I process discomfort and think about another way of being that is not always already defined? And how could I find a productive way to be a misfit, to be a queer, to be promiscuous, and if monetizing that way of being is the end goal, then could we interrogate, why is that the end goal? Why is monetizing anything the end goal? Right. Why is that the only way to live a life? Is there a way to be a productive, engaged human being without being obsessed with financial and monetary success?
I'm hoping I haven't left out any questions. I think I haven't. I just want to say, I don't know if there are other thoughts. I can't, in this system, I can't see if there are other comments or thoughts, but I just want to say how extraordinary the presentations were. I don't know what you hear when you're speaking, but I mean, the three of you were just, I'm going to just say it again, extraordinary. And the answer, then in addition, these answers to the questions have just opened things up more, because now I'm thinking, okay, how do I as an instructor teach that student who is doing exactly what has just been presented to me as a student who is an infidel and a misfit? In other words, am I the instructor who is shutting that down and saying, no, this is a path you take? And so I just want to just say thank you for accepting this invitation and accepting it so beautifully, and inviting us to think about the institutions in which we find ourselves, to take stock of how we are in some ways in our disciplinary units helping to further the violence of our institutions, and to kind of think carefully about how it is possible at the same time to figure out how to imagine differently, to imagine otherwise, but also how to do that in community. I want to thank you so much for leading us through this rethinking this evening. I think that Stacy has something to say as well. I'm sorry, I can't figure out. Stacy is, no.
I can jump back on. I didn't have much else to say. We just wanted to highlight the next couple of Feminisms Unbound panels that are coming up in case you're not in your calendars. We have one more this semester, November 19th, Stillness and Social Movement, and then two in the spring semester. In February 18, we'll cover one on global protest, and on April 15, we'll cover one on going viral. And so the one in November is definitely going to be remote, and you can register for the Zoom webinar. The spring ones, much like everybody, we're still trying to figure out what the semester and events are going to look like, whether they're going to be in person or remote. So for right now, you can register for the remote, and if that shifts or changes, we'll definitely let people know. But definitely thank you so much to all of the panelists for their time and expertise, and people for their wonderful, engaging, insightful questions, and to Faith for moderating.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks so much to the audience.
Thank you so much.
So such a pleasure. Thank you. And thank you, Faith, again.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.